Jim was in the middle of pouring whiskey for a stranger when he realized the man was holding a gun under the bar. What happened next left 50,000 people speechless when the story finally broke in Rolling Stone 3 years later. March 17, 1969. The location was a nameless dive bar on Rose Avenue in Venice Beach, 3 blocks from the ocean. The air was thick with smoke and salt, and the jukebox had been playing The Doors' entire discography on repeat since midnight. Light My Fire, Break On Through, The End, Riders on the Storm. Morrison was working the late shift under the name James Douglas, wearing a stained apron instead of leather pants. But what none of them knew was that Morrison had bought this failing bar 6 weeks earlier for exactly $50,000 in cash, and he was running it as a secret refuge for broken souls who needed somewhere to disappear. The man with the gun was Thomas Mackenzie, 23, a Vietnam vet who'd been dishonorably discharged and had less than 48 hours before his court-martial hearing. He'd driven straight from Camp Pendleton with his service weapon, planning to end it all in this anonymous bar where nobody would recognize him. Mackenzie's sister Sarah had died in a car accident listening to When the Music's Over on the radio. "Your voice is the only thing that makes me feel close to her anymore," Mackenzie whispered when he finally looked up and recognized the barman's eyes. He hadn't come for a drink. He'd come to say goodbye to the last piece of his sister he had left. Morrison slowly reached across the bar, but not for the gun. He poured 2 shots of bourbon, slid one toward Mackenzie, and said something that would change everything. Before we continue with what happened that night, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what Morrison built in that bar would eventually connect to his death in Paris, and the truth has been hidden for over 50 years. The bar had no official name when Morrison bought it in late January 1969, though the faded sign outside still read, The Fog, from its previous incarnation as a fisherman's tavern in the 1950s. The owner, a 72-year-old Portuguese immigrant named Manuel Santos, was 3 months behind on property taxes and facing eviction when a long-haired man in sunglasses walked in at 2 in the morning with a leather briefcase full of cash. Morrison didn't negotiate, didn't ask questions about the business, didn't even tour the cramped storage room or the broken cooler in back. He simply counted out $500 $100 bills onto the sticky bar top, asked Santos not to file the paperwork under his real name, and walked out with the keys. Santos later told his daughter he thought the man was either running from something or running toward something, but he couldn't tell which. What Morrison was actually running from was Morrison himself, or more precisely, the character he'd created on stage that was slowly devouring the poet underneath. By early 1969, Jim, Morrison the Lizard King, had become a prison. Everywhere he went, people expected the shirtless shaman, the drunk prophet, the sexual revolutionary who'd gotten arrested in New Haven for inciting a riot, and would soon face obscenity charges in Miami. But the man who'd studied film at UCLA, who read Rimbaud and Nietzsche in coffee shops, who wrote poetry in notebooks he never showed anyone, that man was suffocating. The bar became his escape hatch, his chance to exist without performance, without expectation, without the weight of being Jim Morrison. He opened the bar only after midnight, and only for people who knew to knock 3 times and wait. There was no advertisement, no business license displayed, no health inspection sticker. Technically, Morrison was operating an illegal speakeasy, though the Venice Beach police had bigger problems in 1969 than a quiet bar that never caused trouble. The clientele came through word of mouth, whispered recommendations passed between artists and musicians and poets who were told about a place where you could drink after hours, and the barman didn't ask questions. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you'd recognize the eyes behind the dark glasses. Morrison worked the bar himself 4 or 5 nights a week, usually from midnight until dawn, pouring drinks and listening more than talking. He kept the jukebox stocked with everything except The Doors. though patrons who recognized him would sometimes feed quarters into the machine just to watch his reaction when his own voice filled the room. He never acknowledged it, never sang along, never explained the lyrics people asked about. He'd just pour another drink and change the subject to Antonin Artaud, or the theater of cruelty, or whether Bob Dylan had sold out by going electric. The conversations that happened in that bar between 1969 and 1971 would have filled a book if anyone had been writing them down. But someone was writing them down, though Morrison didn't know it at the time. A regular patron named Michael McClure, a beat poet who'd performed at the famous Six Gallery reading with Allen Ginsberg, kept detailed journals of his conversations with the mysterious barman he called James. McClure didn't realize he was talking to Jim Morrison for almost 3 months, not until the night Robbie Krieger and John Densmore walked in looking for their missing singer and found him washing glasses in a stained apron. The argument that followed nearly ended the doors that night, but it also led to something else, something that would produce some of the most raw and honest music Morrison ever created. What happened was this. Ray Manzarek, always the diplomat of the group, proposed a compromise. If Morrison needed the bar to stay sane, fine. But what if they used it? What if they turned the back room into a private rehearsal space, a place where they could work on new material away from the pressure of record executives and concert promoters, and the thousands of fans who expected every Doors song to be another Light My Fire? Morrison agreed, but only on one condition. They could only rehearse after 3 a.m., when the last patrons had left and the bar was truly private. They had to earn the space by helping him close down, washing glasses and mopping floors and taking out trash like any other bar workers. For rock stars who'd sold millions of albums, it was a strange kind of humility. But it worked. The backroom sessions began in April 1969 and continued sporadically for the next 2 years. Whenever Morrison wasn't on tour or in court, or disappeared on one of his increasingly frequent benders. The room itself was barely 15 feet square, with exposed pipes running across a water-stained ceiling and a concrete floor that stayed cold even in summer. They brought in minimal equipment, Manzarek's keyboard, a small amp for Krieger, a basic drum kit for Densmore. Morrison sang without a microphone, his voice raw and unfiltered in the small space, bouncing off cinderblock walls that had probably never heard music before. There were no recording devices, no tape machines preserving these sessions for posterity. What happened in that room stayed in that room, which was exactly how Morrison wanted it. But others started showing up, musicians who'd heard rumors about the secret sessions, artists who wanted to witness something real in an industry that felt increasingly plastic and manufactured. Janis Joplin came one night in August 1969, already drunk when she arrived, and ended up in a 4-hour jam session with Morrison that left both of them in tears. They sang old blues standards together, trading verses and bottles, 2 Texas kids who'd become famous for being wild and were slowly realizing the wildness was killing them. Joplin told Morrison she was tired, not physically tired, but soul tired. Tired of being Big Brother's girl. Tired of being the chick who could drink any man under the table. Tired of the performance. Morrison understood completely. They never recorded that session, never spoke about it publicly. But years later, one of the other musicians present that night said it was the most honest music he'd ever heard. Jimi Hendrix came in late September 1970, less than 2 weeks before his death in London, though nobody knew then that time was so short. He'd been in Los Angeles for meetings about a new album, and someone told him about Morrison's bar, about the after-hours sessions, where real musicians played real music. Hendrix brought his Stratocaster and played for maybe 20 people packed into that tiny back room, playing not his hits, but deep blues, the kind of music his father had listened to. the kind of music Hendrix loved before the industry decided he needed to be a psychedelic guitar god. Morrison and Hendrix didn't talk much that night. They communicated through the music, through the shared understanding that fame was a beautiful prison, and they were both serving life sentences. What nobody in that room knew, what wouldn't be discovered until decades later, was that Hendrix told Morrison something in the alley behind the bar while sharing a cigarette around 4 a.m. He said he was tired of the game, tired of the expectations, tired of being Jimi Hendrix. He said sometimes he fantasized about disappearing, just walking away from it all and starting over somewhere nobody knew his name. Morrison apparently nodded and said he'd had the same fantasy, that he'd even thought about faking his death and moving to Africa or South America, somewhere he could write poetry and be anonymous. They both laughed it off as drunk talk, the kind of impossible dreams you share at 4 in the morning and forget by noon. 2 weeks later, Hendrix was dead in a London apartment. 8 months after that, Morrison was dead in a Paris bathtub. Neither death ever quite made sense. But in those months between Hendrix's death and Morrison's own, something shifted in the bar sessions. The music became darker, more introspective, more honest. Morrison was drinking heavier than ever, showing up to his own bar already drunk, sometimes passing out in the back room before the session even started. But when he was lucid, when the alcohol hit that sweet spot between numb and obliterated, he wrote and performed some of the most powerful material of his career. The songs that would eventually become the L.A. Woman album were born in that back room. Raw, blues-based rock that stripped away the psychedelic pretensions and got down to something essential and true. L.A. Woman itself, the title track that many consider Morrison's masterpiece, was essentially a love letter to the city he was preparing to leave, and to the bar where he'd found a kind of freedom he couldn't find anywhere else. The lyrics about driving through the city at night, about Mr. Mojo Rising, about the hidden life beneath the surface spectacle, all of it came from Morrison's experiences working the bar, watching the broken people who showed up after midnight, looking for something they couldn't name. The song was recorded in December 1970, but it had been rehearsed and refined dozens of times in the back room of the Fog, with Morrison singing to walls instead of audiences. Morrison made his last appearance at the bar on March 11, 1971, exactly 2 days before he and Pamela flew to Paris. He worked his usual shift, midnight to dawn, pouring drinks and listening to patrons without saying much. Around 4 in the morning, when only 3 people remained, he locked the front door, poured himself a large bourbon, and told the stragglers that this was his last night, that he was leaving and probably wouldn't be back. One of those 3 people later told an interviewer that Morrison seemed relieved, like a weight had been lifted, but also profoundly sad, like he was leaving behind the last place where he'd felt like himself. What Morrison did next shocked the remaining patrons. He walked to the jukebox, fed it a handful of quarters, and played The End, the 11-minute epic that had become the Doors' signature piece. He stood behind the bar, glass in hand, and listened to his own voice, singing about fathers and sons and killing and death and rebirth. When it ended, he raised his glass to the empty room and said something that nobody quite caught, something that might have been a toast or a prayer or a goodbye. Then he took off his apron, left it folded on the bar, walked out the back door, and never returned. 3 days later, Morrison was in Paris. 16 weeks after that, he was dead. The official story says heart failure in a bathtub at 17 Rue Beautreillis, no autopsy performed, buried quickly at Père Lachaise Cemetery, before most people even knew he'd died. And then there's what happened to the bar itself. According to property records, Morrison sold the Fog on March 10, 1971, 1 day before his final shift, to a buyer listed only as PC Holdings. The sale price was $1. The new owner kept the bar closed for 4 months, then apparently tried to reopen it in late July 1971, just weeks after Morrison's death. But before the doors could open, a fire broke out in the early hours of August 3rd, 1971. The Venice Beach Fire Department responded within minutes, but the old wooden structure burned fast and hot. By dawn, nothing remained but charred beams and ash. The fire investigation report listed the cause as undetermined but suspicious. There were no electrical issues, no gas leaks, no obvious accelerants detected. The report also noted something strange. The fire seemed to have started in multiple locations simultaneously, which suggested either a very unlikely accident or deliberate arson. No charges were filed, no suspects identified, and within 6 months, the lot had been sold and redeveloped into the apartment building that stands there today. In 2008, a construction crew renovating one of the ground floor apartments discovered a hidden compartment beneath the concrete foundation, a small crawl space that had survived the fire. Inside were 3 fireproof boxes containing notebooks filled with handwriting that experts later confirmed belonged to Jim Morrison. They also contained reel-to-reel tapes, unmarked and unlabeled, that turned out to be recordings of the backroom sessions. Morrison and the Doors working through early versions of L.A. Woman, Morrison and Janis Joplin singing blues standards, Morrison reading poetry to listeners in that tiny concrete room. The construction worker who discovered them contacted the Morrison estate and was told that going public would result in legal action for possession of stolen property. He agreed to turn over the materials in exchange for compensation. The notebooks and tapes disappeared into the estate's archives, where they remain today, inaccessible to researchers or fans. The estate's position is that Morrison clearly intended these materials to remain private, that respecting his artistic wishes means keeping them locked away. The notebooks reportedly contain poetry, ranging from brilliant to embarrassing, deeply personal reflections on Morrison's struggles with fame and addiction, and political views that might complicate his carefully maintained image. The tapes allegedly include not just music, but conversations, arguments between band members, Morrison drunk and rambling, Morrison lucid and insightful, the full spectrum of human experience rather than the edited highlights. The bar where Jim Morrison poured drinks and found himself is gone, burned to nothing and buried under concrete. But somewhere in a climate-controlled vault, the voice of that barman still exists on magnetic tape, singing blues with Janis, arguing philosophy with strangers, being human instead of legendary.